Welcome back to the Embodied Faith podcast. Today, we're talking about trauma again, and we're asking the question whether trauma, in some sense, whether explicit or not, has become the defining reality in the West. And if so, the church must learn how to engage this new context of mission and witness. Today, I'm joined with pastor and community organizer Fred Liggin, and he is going to be talking about the things he's experienced and learned in his community and in the different community organizations that he's been involved with. So the question we're asking or hoping to answer is engaging trauma as the church's new mission field. As always, Embodied Faith podcast is brought to you by Grassroots Christianity, which seeks to grow faith for everyday people. So Fred Liggin is a multi-vocational pastor in Williamsburg at Williamsburg Christian Church. He's the founder of the 3E Restoration Organization, which is a community development agency working to break the cycles of homelessness there in Williamsburg. Fred is also a contextual theologian, a clinical trauma professional, and a community organizer and professor. And he is also one of the founding board members of the Virginia Racial Healing Institute. And most of all, I like to call Fred a friend. So welcome to the show again.
Hey, thanks for allowing me to be on again, brother.
Yeah, well, we're so excited to have you. You were the kind of the first guest on about a year ago in season one to talk about trauma. Now I've actually had kind of a running series. We've had multiple episodes on trauma, but I wanted to kind of circle back and engage this issue kind of on a bigger kind of picture. Our first episode, we just kind of asked, well, what do you hope that pastors would know about trauma so that they could just be a little bit more informed? And I've kind of hit that a bunch of times with a bunch of different guests. And so now we kind of want to step back as you're a pastor, you're a contextual theologian, you're a community organizer. You know, I'm a pastor, I'm a professor, right? So we want to step back and ask this question, which is trauma, in a sense, one of the main or the main context for mission in North America for the church? And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about. So if I just throw that out to you, what do you feel like that is? What does that mean? What does it mean that trauma is the context of mission in North America for the church?
Well, if you know the difference is the word "the," right, or versus "a." And here's what I'd say, like the contextual theologian in me, and I know with you, we're not one for like abstract generalizations, right? Every context, every city, every space has its own DNA, its own culture. But we do share in something in North America, and particularly in the United States of America, we share in a global pandemic. And regardless of people's positions ideologically on how that worked or didn't work, we were surrounded by and covered by what would be called a traumagenic event. So it would be very easy to position this conversation in light of a societal trauma that our entire country walked through together. And so you could say that there's the in this, that this is the mission field. Every person we encounter, every person in our church families, every person in our neighborhoods and cities, and in the public square has lived through an event, a traumagenic event, has lived through collective trauma together, or societal trauma together. So there's not a person we're going to encounter who hasn't experienced something traumagenic, generally speaking, and we know that now. But I think as a shared collective trauma, that's even more real maybe than it ever has been. And if you say, well, not the pandemic, well, then you can have milestone markers that took place during the COVID experience, whether it be a January 6th event or the lynching of Arbery or the murder of Floyd or whatever the case may be. So we have a societal trauma reality at work in our society, I think. So yeah, I think it's a mission field because I think it makes up who we are right now.
Sure. So for over the last 2+ years, we've had global pandemic in the United States, plus a lot of just exploding racial realities. Going back even before that, you could talk about like 9/11 or things like that as society. So, there's all sorts of kind of social, societal, collectively traumatic kind of
Right.
events. But there's also it sure seems, and I'm just throwing this at you. I didn't even prep you for this. Like I like to organize these kind of things. But since you're one of my friends, I'm just going to throw stuff at you. But do you feel that in the U.S. we're more trauma prone in general? And I don't know about like historically, but is that a sense, maybe in the field, this is like something that you're studying, like, is there a sense in which we're more trauma prone? And that's part of why this is a mission field for us now.
I don't know if I'd say we're more trauma prone. I think we're a different kind of trauma prone. I think we're trauma prone. And, and okay, so if you take the most like baseline definition of trauma, which is this idea of an emotional wounding that arises from an actual threat to one's way of life, right? So then you've got my security, my safety, my way of life, my being. That if it is threatened in such a way that it does something inside of me, that could, if it's exacerbated or continue it over time, could do something inside of me that provokes what we call a trauma response, or in trauma training, we'd say a cycle of violence where we act out, where we're acting in and then we act out toward others. I would say that our country's privilege and power for a majority peoples, I would say our country's comfort and abundance certainly gives us makes us vulnerable to a different kind of trauma experience. I would say that. I just wouldn't say we're trauma prone more so than any other.
All right. Well, you're not saying that, but I'm going to say that. I was talking with another therapist friend about this, and I'm waiting on the research. But she said that it's striking that how much material provision or privilege that the United States has, that we also seem to be so prone to being traumatized. That, and I guess they were like the WHO actually like did this kind of study about how um, in the West, we seem disproportionately traumatized for the amount of wealth and abundance that we have as a society. And that this is something people are wondering about. Now, we don't have to go down that train, but it does seem that, this is a mission field, whether it's growing divorce rates, which is, an adverse childhood experience is divorced families, and this is growing childhood poverty, just the exposure to violent imagery, whether it's through the news or through entertainment, it must be doing something to our collective psyches to create this kind of trauma prone environment. So we don't have to go down the root of the causes. We'll just let me do that on my Facebook feed. But for you,
Well, hold
right?
on.
Okay, go ahead. You want to jump in?
Let's say this because I mean, those folks are smarter than me, so I'm not going to argue with that, especially if they're doing the actual research and the data. But what I can imagine, is that there are certain collectives in our society whose lack of familiarity with suffering means our resilience capacity isn't all that great.
Yes.
I wouldn't say we're as resilient as we'd like to believe ourselves to be, particularly white bodies, and not to try and open that can on this, but I think there has to be a differentiation in a racialized cultural system, that a majority of people sitting in positions of privilege, power, have a sense of aggrieved entitlement, right? And so I do think abundance and comfort over the course of a period of time doesn't necessarily equate to a kind of resilience that knows how to endure suffering in healthy ways. And like you say, trauma response and cycles of violence come as one's inability, and that's not a knock at our ability, but inability to handle a threat or a perceived threat of a way of life. I mean, I think that's where you get January 6th. I mean, how many marches have we had in this country's history where no one's ever ransacked the Capitol? And now, why now? And I think there are markers in our cultural movement that could be challenged. And I think a trauma lens is an appropriate lens to interpret a significant portion of those movements.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So we won't go down, the rabbit hole of possible causes.
Yeah, that's your
Although,
Facebook feed, like you said.
yeah. I'll do that later because I have ideas about these things. I have lots of ideas. So,
Absolutely.
but you just brought this up. So what do you think it means as a, not kind of like abstractly, but as a pastor of a local church, as a community organizer in a city, engaging in the mission of God and God's kingdom come in the world? For you, what does it mean to think of trauma like as a theological category, or or as something that influences how we do this thing called like mission?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know how to answer that well. So I'll try it this way. I believe it's how one sees their vocation as pastor. So I do not believe that I'm called to pastor a congregation as much as I am called to pastor that congregation in light of a larger context where we're all missionaries. And to be missionaries mean we have to be good neighbors. And to be good neighbors means we have to be in the places and spaces that we wouldn't choose otherwise to go where neighbors are, which also means we need to be in places where neighbors are suffering. So I believe part of the vocational call of pastor is to be present in the city, to be present at tables that have nothing to do with church, nothing to do with religion, that have everything to do with neighbor to neighbor love, that have everything to do with being peaceable with neighbors. And so to me, mission field, if it's about presence and it's about being faithfully present within one's context, and that's what it is for me, then you're going to necessarily encounter the traumagenic realities of your context, because that's where the suffering is going to be felt. That's where the suffering is going to be seen. That's where the suffering is going to be named. That's where the pain will be named. And I think pastors need to be present in these spaces. And then pastors bring that experience and any neighbors that are encountered into that experience, into the gathered people of God, and talk about what it means to be faithful in that city, to faithful in that context. Pastors need to be more than just present in neighborhoods. They need to be present in the neighborhoods, yes. And there's lots of movement in, Christianity in certain conversations about neighborhood presence. They need to be present in cities too, or at least blocks of cities if you're in a large locality. But let's be honest, the fact is most pastors are not in San Francisco. They're in Williamsburg, Virginia. They're in smaller localities, and we don't equip for that. So pastors need to re-embrace a civic responsibility of presence. And that's where you necessarily encounter the pain and the suffering of others. And then you bring that pain and suffering to bear in the story of God, and you invite the people of God to enter into that space and be present with neighbors. So to me, it's all connected. I don't know how we don't do that.
Mm-hmm. How we don't, but unfortunately, there's so many pastors and churches who are not connected to the local pain. And part of that, I think, is in our theological training or our preparation for pastoring is, I certainly wasn't trained to like name and engage the local pain of a community. I was, trained to like preach the gospel or something like that. I was trained to organize, this thing called church, maybe do a little pastoral counseling and refer people out. But this idea of kind of naming and dwelling in the pain is, I think, something that a lot of times we don't think of as part of church mission. We're just supposed to get rid of the pain, or the gospel is supposed to fix all these things or something like that. Just last week or 2 weeks ago during Holy Week, we had an episode about reflecting on Jesus and calling him the man of trauma. So coming from Isaiah 53, but that was not something I was trained in. Like, hey, make sure to be in touch with the trauma Jesus suffered so that you can be in touch with the other people's trauma as you witness to them as a way of sharing the gospel. So part of it is our pastoral preparation. The other part is it's really hard.
That's the point. Like I have had great training and with a missional impulse, right? From my graduate to my postgraduate work, don't get me wrong. But we were doing this before that. To me, this is about it's hard. It's just hard. And I think when you're pastoring a church, it's hard to pastor a church in and of itself, right? All the counseling, all the hurt inside the body. Then you've got all the mechanics of pastoring, the Sunday events and all the programmatic pieces. And depending on if you have a team or if you're solo, there's lots of reasons why we shouldn't have the time to enter into the tables with our local social services agencies or our local human services agencies or our local community action agencies. There's lots of reasons why we shouldn't be involved in COVID response teams within the citywide. But my point is the mission of God is the reason to do that. You got to say no to some things so you can say yes to other things. And if you say yes to the right things, you have some of the guidance you need on the other things you said no to before. And a lot of times we just don't. It's just harder. I mean, dude, I'd rather just sit in an office and write a sermon and call it a day and just shepherd people and be with people and meet and do Bible study and all those beautiful, beautiful things that I think are beautiful. But the majority of my time is spent in the city. The
Mhm.
majority of my time is meeting with people. I say majority, that's not fair, but a significant portion of my time is being in spaces where pain and suffering are. And you said have to name it. I don't have to name it. I just listen to the names that it's given.
Mhm.
And then I take those names back to the people of God. And we discern what it means to be present in that together.
Well, let's shift and then start looking at or talking about some of the specifics of like a church engaging in this trauma field. But really quick, for those who are listening and watching live, you can ask questions or make comments, and Fred and I will try to engage with them as we go. Andy Brock is really glad that you're back on the
Andy,
podcast.
I love Andy. Andy's a good man. He's a good man. See, he's a pastor who's taking this seriously, like right, like he's pushing out there.
Amen to that. And Andy, thanks for listening live. And I just got to press a button that I don't usually get to press because, I like it when people comment live. So let's go to this. What does it mean for a church to think about, not just think about, but to live into this mission field of trauma? So can you talk about maybe some general principles? You talk about like security and support and voice and choice, and how do you create these spaces that kind of help people feel safe and supported and things like that. And then we could maybe move a little bit more specifically to things like preaching or worship or small groups or something like that. So what are some like general principles that you kind of have in mind that you've been trained into or that you've just stumbled upon as you've been doing this?
You mentioned security, support, voice, and choice. Those are four pillars of commitment from what I call hospitality's leadership, and they're grounded in trauma. So it's kind of it's a trauma responsive way of being present and leading. And so I think they come through two directions. Can my church family be a place of security, support, voice, and choice for the city? Like, are we a place where people can find a sense of security, meaning that basic human needs are met and not at the expense of others? So resources, jobs, social climate networks, institutions that provide safety, including relationships. Can we be a people where there's consistency of forgiveness and where there's boundary and where there's faithfulness, where there's space to heal? That's what I mean when I say security. And that happens from the church to the city in relationship to its neighbor, but also the church within itself. So can we be a community where security is possible? I'm not one who throws the word safety around too easily. I'm not sure that people are safe in church. I'm not sure I can say that that's possible, but I can say that it's possible to be secure in a church family, even because, we can commit to doing no harm, but in a context of trauma response, harms are easy to come by.
So
I think
what is that difference? Because I've never heard that distinction. So what's the difference between having people feel safe and then making them be secure or something like that? What's the difference?
I think it's if by safe you mean never hurt and never wounded, then you and I think both know that's not possible in a church community, especially if you're a community who's made up of a people who are in trauma response or are trying to resolve that trauma response. Right? Or if you're in a diverse community where traumagenic events have taken place or where people are living through trauma response, I'm going to, at the very least, I'm going to say something that could be harmful, not purposeful, but maybe just ignorant, maybe thoughtless. And on my worst day, on a bad day, maybe purposeful, right? But it's certainly going to happen within the community. And so safe means I feel that I'm free of being wounded and free of being harmed. I don't know. We can commit to that, and I think we should commit to that and do all the things necessary to commit to that for certain. I don't want anybody to mishear me there. But I know we can provide security. I know we can say that we're going to have a way of being here together within the gospel, that when those harms happen, we repent, we make right the harm, and we meet the need that the harm created, and we meet the obligation that the needs create, and we will do what's necessary to restore and repair. I think a church can commit to that. A church can commit to restorative justice when harms are created both within itself and within its city. And so I want to, that's what I mean. So does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's committed to that process of security. So then what would support mean?
Support.
So committed to security, but also support.
Well, if we foster a culture and experience of security, we foster a cultural and experience of support. We can be faithful and consistent in our presence, where we're committed to relationality, empathy, compassion, where those are the guiding values, that you're not alone. If you're secure, then you know you're not alone. And that in and of itself becomes support. You and I have read a lot of the same material, I'm sure, when it
Mostly
comes to
because you told me to read it. So you're
well, no, that is, but one of the things, no, but one of the things that I believe, oh, I forgot who said it now. Maybe Brenda Colt said that it's not so much what happens to you; it's who's with you when it happens.
mm-hmm.
That the necessity of community and not being alone is critical toward one's healing and resolving one's own suffering, story of suffering, or particularly trauma and trauma response. So when there's security, there's necessarily support.
Mm-hmm.
And then if there's support, then there's voice, right? Like if I have security and I feel supported, then I am able to use the voice I have. I won't go unheard. The power dynamics will be called into question. The power dynamics that are usually at work that drown out other voices will be called into question. They will be challenged and subverted. Because it's been said that not having your own voice is a second wave of trauma. So when stories aren't heard, are mistrusted, are misbelieved, are maligned, then that becomes a second wave of trauma that we inadvertently create even in our communities of faith and within our city, the church to the city relationship, as well as the church within the church relationship. So security and support leads to voice, where everyone has a voice, where the power that operates at personal, interpersonal, and structural levels are called into question, and then that leads to the next word, which we call choice, where naturally when you have the mic and your voice is heard, for lack of a better term, you are given a choice to address whatever the voice reveals, where voice empowers us to identify the choices that need to be made. And that's hard work because that's dangerous and it's messy. It's dangerous and messy. And I think those are adequate words, both from the church to the city's relationship, and then the church within the church and its relationship. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is true for if I were to bring in kind of a different angle of like attachment research and insecure attachment is people, like childhood developmental trauma. If you, um, even as an infant are crying out for help and you don't get the help that you need,
Right.
that
Right.
accentuates the stress that you're already going through, like I'm hungry or I'm cold or whatever, right? So now your stress is being accentuated, but then added to that is the stress of um, when I call out, I don't get a response, and so I'm actually trying to do something. So not only am I in stress, but now I'm distressed about my own ability to get what I need, and that I don't have a voice in this.
Right.
And trauma happens in the same way, whereas people, because of the trauma and because of the stress that is unmanaged or unregulated, or even not articulated, like I can't even put into words what happened to me because I disassociated or whatever. Um, and so the bringing to voice is good both for themselves because it actually helps to integrate all the things that have happened to them, right? Through sharing their story, through listening and being with. But then it's also good for the people who hear to hear the story.
Right.
Oh, like, you needed to give voice to yourself, but I needed to hear your voice so I understand the situation. And then from that, then new choices emerge. Whereas before we felt trapped either in semi automatic responses, we were trapped in old social norms,
Right.
and all these types of things, right? We can go total neurological and we can also go cultural systematic, right? But we're trapped in these choices that don't feel like choices or choices that were made for us. And so you're saying, we need to be environments where we can actually create security support, offer people the chance to voice who they are, what has happened to them, in such a way that accountability is and understanding is built, and the new choices seem to be emerging, and all that is hard work, um, and it takes a lot of time. So no wonder this is really hard work to do. We'd rather
It's
just kind of get to the preaching the word and administering the sacraments or something like that.
Yeah, it's exhausting because now you have to step back and say, okay, so as a pastoral team or whatever one's leadership polity is, in ours we have a shared leadership model. So now we get back and we reevaluate all of the impulses of the church, programmatically, event, space, everything, internally liturgies, and start asking, do these things make possible security, support, voice, and choice? And that's very functional. That's a very functional question, because now everything is up for negotiation in how we gather together, because being a person or a community who makes space for others living through trauma response to have voice and choice, if you do that, it limits the potential. It could still happen, obviously, and I know it does, but it limits the potential of objectification, of marginalization, and some form of subjugation, right? Like it pushes back and calls into question the power dynamics that are explicit or implicit within the church itself, based on all the different factors within the systems and social location of who we are, and within the church to the city. So again, I want to say that there is a horizontal reality to this that extends beyond the people of God into the city. Mm-hmm. And it unfolds and should unfold. So is our church the kind of church that gives the proverbial microphone to the city to speak to people in our city, to people who are not being heard? Maybe there are people in our cities who aren't heard by people who are in power in the city. Can the church be a place where they're heard at least there? But for that to happen, can the people within the church be heard within their own church? And see, these are the questions that have to be asked. And that, again, I want to say this. I think I said this last time. This is like the theme of life. Is exhausting.
We keep needing to hear it.
Yeah, but it's life-giving. But it does change how you pastor. Now, I'm a terrible preacher. And I'm not saying that in a self-deprecating way. I'm just not a good preacher. And I don't spend a lot of time writing messages the way I was taught to write. I've been trained by some of the best, in my opinion, rhetoricians I've ever heard and storytellers I've heard. I speak from a place of where we've been as a community in our city. That's where I speak. So like podcast and online streaming, like I'm not speaking to you, Jeff. Like if you were to listen to a WCC podcast, I'm not speaking to Jeff. Mm-hmm. I'm not speaking to you where you live and where you are. I'm speaking to who we are in our particular place. Even if it generically or abstractly or theologically connects to you wherever you sit, it's coming from a place within who we are.
So yeah, let's talk about these specific practices or activities that, we typically associate with a church. So you just started bringing up preaching. And so one of your preaching commitments or kind of rules of thumb or your practice is, I'm preaching to my people here. I'm not preaching to a generic human being or the universal human or the abstract kind of ideas that scripture kind of speaks to, right? You're not speaking to the human condition or to sin or something like that, right? You're speaking to your people. Yes. So that'd be one specific kind of practice. But what would be another kind of thing in your mind, like in a previous episode, Adrian, she mentioned that trauma is really just not making it harder for people to engage. I should have written it down. She said something. It was so concise. It was not giving people more baggage than the baggage they walked in with, right? not putting more obstacles in front of them than what they already have, right? That's what being trauma informed kind of is. So in your preaching, like, how do you what are your kind of thoughts? Like, how can I make sure I don't trip people up unnecessarily? Certainly the gospel or transformation and things are hard. But do you have like a rubric in your mind of things to avoid or things to do?
Yeah. Okay. So I do, and I don't do it all that well. Like I try, right? Like I try to do it as well as I can. There are two things, and I know I'm going to it's like a drum, but that security, support, voice, and choice thing, that is like echoing in my head constantly, like just generally speaking. Even right now, as I'm with you, I'm thinking about WCC family, Williamsburg Christian Church family. Like if they watch, and we've got people who listen to this too. So as, cause we read your book and people picked up your podcast. And so I'm trying to think, okay, what are they hearing right now? So it's always in my head. But there's a phrase that was told to me when I was sitting at a table many years ago, and we were talking about, racial injustice. This was a decade ago. But in this city, and I had one sister say to me, she said, "Nothing about me without me." Mm-hmm. And that has been a phrase that rings and echoes in my head. Anytime I stand in a pulpit or stand before a people and I begin to tell a story, or I begin to try to relate a narrative of trauma, whether it's a reality of societal trauma or whether it's just a traumagenic event that someone's living through, I always make sure that the voice that when I'm using my voice, that my voice is actually lending a voice to the story, to the person who's lived the story. So that may mean I don't tell the story at all. That may mean I tell the story with a letter that they've written. And if they give me permission to tell the story, then I run the story by them. And I know that sounds very rote, but I think the idea of nothing about me without me is a good principle. If the church is going to talk about a particular issue within its locality, then it needs to bring and center the voices of those living through the issue. Otherwise, if they're not careful, they'll lose the person for the issue.
Hmm.
And so as we're pastoring spaces, even preaching, teaching spaces, I think it's important to center the voices of those to whom the gospel is speaking most poignantly to on any given Sunday. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Good. So nothing about me without me. So making sure people's stories are their stories. Is there another one before we move away from preaching onto maybe some other practices or?
I mean, there are lots of other practices, but in terms of the preach, are you speaking in terms of the preaching event? Because I think sometimes it just means that sometimes preaching doesn't happen when we gather. Sometimes we don't preach. Sometimes I'm certainly not the one doing it. Sometimes it's not someone who's been trained in it. I think again, if you're going to try and create a community where security, support, voice, and choice is a part of the life of the community, then that means the preaching event itself is going to be challenged from time to time. So, and I value preaching. I'm not one who doesn't believe that there's a need for it in the life of the people of God. And there are different ways to get at it in different community spaces as to who the common life of the church. But I do think it's important that for someone who generally holds the pulpit, that we don't hold it too tightly, and that we are willing to step aside and let other people's voices be heard. And the consequences of their voices being heard, our job may be to navigate the consequences of that voice being heard, the choices that now have been revealed. And that's where the real pastoral work comes. It comes across the tables the other days of the week based upon what we learn together on a Sunday. So sometimes a preaching event just gets challenged as a whole.
Sure. Well, what happens, or what would be the reason not to preach a sermon?
Preaching, what would be the reason not to preach a sermon? If there's something that needs to be lamented.
Okay,
And
so lament.
We need to sit with lament. And maybe we sit with Lectio Divina instead. Maybe we sit with the text together and we discern the reading of the text together, literally openly as a community of faith in light of the real life experience that's gone on inside of us. Or maybe there's something that we need to celebrate and just give joy to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we need to just spend time celebrating and giving joy. And letting joy have its way with us in the gathered people. And so what ends up happening is as a preacher, you end up being more of a facilitator. You end up being more of an MC than you are maybe the primary voice of that Sunday, if you're speaking at all. Again, I think it's very contextual, but those are things we've done when we've had lamentable events locally, or when things have happened nationally and it's impacted it's impacted us, like the moms and the dads or the women and the men or the children in the community of faith, then we have to give space for that. And if there's time, maybe offer a word, but always bring the word into it. But whether or not I'm the one offering it may or may not be the case.
Sure. Well, you mentioned lament and then joy and celebration. And it seems like creating more space for those emotive or affective expressions rather than the overly cognitive preaching of information. Not that that's all preaching ever is, but there is, that is the very word kind of based medium. And so sometimes say, hey, like we actually don't need that right now. Like we need more of an embodied expression of tears and crying, or an embodied expression of celebration and gathering around people. And so I think that's really important.
And sometimes sometimes regularly we make room on Sundays for voices in the community to come in and tell us about what's happening. So the director of human services may come and speak. The director of foster care in our local system may come and speak. And we dialogue at a table and we dialogue communally. An immigration attorney may come and speak to tell us the truth about what it really means to be asylee or refugee or immigrant in our city, specifically within our city. So it's also, again, the church is the gathering place. Are we introducing the community of faith to the voices of others, which inadvertently allow those voices to be heard inside of us, and then allows us to listen to the voice of the city? So I think that's also important.
So what I'm hearing, not to be too snarky, is that if we're to engage trauma as the church's new mission field, our engagement has to be big enough to encapsulate our entire lives, and that might even impinge upon the preaching moment on Sunday mornings. Like like your entire life, is engaging the whole city that you're in, and so that should be a part of, all these things, all the stuff we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and if that's a church's only equipping impulse, then that's going to be problematic. So what that means then, we as a leadership have to step back and go, how are we equipping the people of God in light of the vision of God revealed to us in the person of God, through the scriptures of God, to be faithful in this space? If we're not going to do it on Sunday, where else are we doing that? So now it impacts how you organize the common life of the church.
Right. Well, speaking of the common life of the church, Andy asked a really good question that I want to shoot over to you. And have you found, I'm sure you have, that the trauma within a faith community has blinded the leaders to the trauma in the greater community? Or maybe it goes the other direction, is that the trauma existing in the greater community is affecting the church. So we've kind of talking, about engaging the city that we're in as a church, but is it possible, and it certainly seems possible, that traumas within the church keep us from engaging the things that are going more broadly? What are your thoughts on that? How have you seen that happen? Or
Yeah, because the people in your church live in the city, right? Like we're all tired sometimes. Like we're all tired. We're all weary of these conversations. We all, like, many times the one of the complaints I would get, especially over the last 2 years, when it just seemed like something was happening every week in our country, much less the world, is people would be like, "Look, I just want to come, and I just want to, I want to release all that. I want to come to a space and release it, and I don't need you to remind me one more time of the traumas in the world." We're tired. There's a certain kind of compassion fatigue that's at work. And the vicarious trauma, right, Jeff, like the vicarious trauma works its way into our lives, and we come to the gathering and we want to just come to the table and just be free of having to put any more mental and emotional faculties at work to try to address traumas that are going on outside of us, because we're carrying our own too. And what I'm saying is there's got to be room for that too. Mm-hmm. And for us, like how we frame going to Eucharist, how we frame receiving the bread and the wine, which we do in our tradition every week. And every church is different, and I get that. And people will disagree, and that's fine. But for WCC, for Williamsburg Christian Church, we begin our gathering, every gathering, the first word we speak as a gathered church is what we call a declaration of who I am and who we are. And it comes directly from 2 Peter. So it begins with, I am God's chosen beloved, royal priest, a citizen of God's holy nation, to proclaim the mighty deed. And we see that. And then we do we are God's chosen beloved, a royal priesthood, holy nation, a people for his possession, to proclaim the mighty deeds of the one who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Those are the first two things we say together as a gathered community, almost as a declaration and confession, in the hopes that however disoriented we are by our own trauma response or by our own traumagenic events we've experienced or by wearisome of what's going on outside of us, that in that moment the Spirit of God can meet us there and we can move through the gathering together, still as God's chosen beloved, while also remembering we are still God's royal priesthood.
I love that.
Holding that is so critical. And then from there, we move into our rule of life, which is love one another for God's sake, protect one another's kingdom values, believe one another's motives, sing one another's praises, and guard one another's backs. And so we move. Those are our first three moves. Before the note is played on a guitar, we confess those things together, and we're led through that confession. And then out of that reorientation, with us and God, us and one another, and us in society, move into the rest of the liturgy. Those impulses are super. This sounds so I just sound like my son. They're super important, but they're super important. Because if I blow it, if I'm offering a word and I blow it that Sunday, or if the music blows it, or if something happens that just makes everything amuck, you will have come and had that read and spoken over you, and you would have spoken that yourself. You'd have spoken that over yourself and over one another.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And we're a church that has lots of children who are neurodivergent. I mean, I'm neurodivergent, but we have a lot of children who live with ASD. And we have things happen in the middle of a gathering where we pause where a child's having a hard Sunday, and we will pause the music, we will pause whatever, and we will gather with that child and that mother to de-escalate, allow that child to go to the coping room, and then we will say to that mama, as they gather people, we've done this several times, I will, as a pastor, will look her in the eye in front of the people of God and say, you are loved, you are a faithful mama, this is a hard day, and we're in this together, and let's pray over her, and then we carry on.
Yeah.
So it's like also being willing to be disrupted in the midst of that. Now, how do we do that? We have these confessions. And if we don't live out those confessions in the hour and a half we're together, we're not going to live them out the other 6 days of the week.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, just to point those last couple things out then. So structurally you have what'd you say, a coping room, right? So, family, like churches have nurseries or they have the cry room off the sanctuary. But, if we're going to going to engage trauma seriously, then maybe we need a coping room like that. Then you also are normalizing meltdowns and bad days. And you are reaffirming those who might feel ashamed or inadequate as caregivers to those people or partners, because a lot of times a husband and a wife or a partner will make excuses or feel bad for the behavior of their partner. Right. So then you're normalizing. It's not your fault. We see you. We love you. We're all trying to do our best. And so those are important practices also for the community.
It is. And to Andy's question, normalizing them in the gathered space gives room for all of us to breathe in a way that's surprising. Mm-hmm. And then when we can breathe, and our windows of tolerance, I know you've talked about this many times, but our windows can open, then we have the resilience. We have the capacity now to remember our place as God's chosen beloved and as God's royal priesthood. Mm-hmm. And not feel like we have to negotiate one for the other, to become a bunch of activists where we're just worn out and doing it on our own strength, where the reign of Christ isn't even seen or known hardly until, we're desperate. Or where it's all just about me and me and me and me, and it's like therapeutic, God who does therapy for me and makes me feel good about me. It's holding the two as a part of the whole.
Amen. Well, and there's so much more we can kind of keep saying and keep circling around, but what would you say, and again, for you, speaking to your people, but what for you has become kind of the essence or kind of your go-to way of explaining the gospel within this kind of traumatized environment that you're ministering in? Like what's your, and I know there's, you and I don't really believe in, there's one essence to the gospel, but for you, what has become that kind of cornerstone for you when it comes to, this is what the gospel, this is the kingdom of God in the world?
At the risk of sounding almost worshipful of David Fitch, but I've been formed by his teaching. We've talked about that. I mean, my training, I love the man. But we're committed to faithful presence. And for me specifically, that's bound up in the theology of hospitality, which means then that I genuinely believe, and I am willing to say that wherever you are, Christ is. Mm-hmm. And even within the old tradition of the hiddenness of God, I always say to people, just as much as the moon is still round when the clouds have covered it and all you see is a half moon or maybe no moon at all, God is still present in that. And at some point, and I'm going to be with you until those clouds part. Mm-hmm. Or we're going to be with you until those clouds part, because Christ somehow Christ is present. I don't know what Christ is doing. I don't know what's going on. And so I'm going to be angry. You be angry. We'll be angry together. We'll lament together. And at some point, we're just going to hope that the clouds part and the presence of Christ that has always been will be revealed.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you for being so faithful there in your church, in your particular context. And this is something that we'll probably be talking about, for another 5, 10, 25 years, is engaging the cultural landscape, this traumatic or traumatizing or trauma-prone landscape, however we kind of think about it. And so there's lots more that could be said. So we'll kind of keep talking about it, and I think just to cue a future conversation, a lot of people are turning not from, but saying, well, the next step for engaging trauma is actually to become more resilient. And you kind of talked about that at the beginning, is have we lost resilience? Have we lost capacity for suffering, for pain and things like that? And so then how do we regain that resilience as we follow Christ in the world? So maybe that's to cue up another conversation. But as always, this is you can get this podcast, the Embodied Faith podcast, where we're seeking the intersection of neuroscience, spiritual formation, and faith. You can find it on iTunes, Spotify, all the Google playlists, and all those types of things. You can also find it here on my YouTube channel, which is Jeffrey Holsclaw. You just look for the playlists for Embodied Faith. And Fred, thanks again for jumping on.
Hey, thank you for letting me, brother. I appreciate it very much.
Well, let's do it again. I'm sure we will do it again.
Absolutely.